glad to have you here. Our speaker for tonight is Bert de Bruijn, and he is going to be talking to us about some work that he's been doing. I was going to say on the side, he's an IT security consultant, but he's been doing this work for a long time, so I don't know if they're in parallel, they're in the, how that works. He can tell you that part of the story, but he's got a real passion for kind of bringing historical information into a geospatial context to better kind of illustrate, what was going on at those times, and in particular looking at some of the military battles and things like that. So he's going to talk a little bit about the process and a little bit about some of the stuff that he's got on the go. So welcome, Bert, and hear what you have to say.
Okay. Thanks, Dennis. So, as Dennis mentioned, I do IT consulting by the day, and I've actually been a member of the GoGeomatics community since about February of 2012. So one of the original sort of members. My background and why I came to be a member was because of a project that I started called WikiWar, and I started this project in 2008, a long time ago now, 10 years almost. And the idea was to crowdsource and then geovisualize military history. So clearly there's a large mapping component involved in geovisualizing history. And prior to that, I had been in the Canadian Infantry for 7 years. And then I've been doing IT consulting for about 18 of those years, most of it for the Canadian Defense Department. So with WikiWar, the idea is to take a base map and then animate it with actual unit movements so that you can actually see a battle happen. So back in October of last year, I was down in Boulder, Colorado, and I showed this video, which is an animation of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And the idea was just to illustrate in a simplistic fashion what it looks like when you actually have troops that are following closely in behind a creeping artillery barrage. And as you can see, there's a lot of lines on the map, and those little squiggly lines are actually the German trench system. But as you can see, a lot of the map is pretty bare. So, I mean, it was good enough to present in a simplistic way what that battle may have looked like. But I really wanted it to be a lot more filled out, like this. So then the question is, well, how do we get from that really bare map to this kind of a map where it's really filled out, really detailed? And I'll just start by, or back up a bit by saying that the original map that I used for my presentation in Boulder was done by the person who's keeping Open Historical Map running, Dr. Rob Warren. He runs a project called the meetup Project, which is all about World War I. So he was the one who actually built out that first really bare map of the Vimy area. But this is what I wanted to do, and I wanted to do this type of detail work for the entire map area. So that's what I'm going to be presenting tonight, is a bit of the story on how I got there. Well, most of the way there. So is everybody familiar with OpenStreetMap? Show of hands. Okay. Anyone not familiar with OpenStreetMap? Okay, so OpenStreetMap is it's kind of like Google Maps, except that instead of it being a commercial application like Google Maps is, OpenStreetMap is open data. It's built by the community, maintained by the community, and the whole data set is free. So you can do whatever you want with it, and you can add to it, make changes, and it's a really, really helpful project for developers, because when it comes time to actually start picking a base map to be able to build your application on top of, that's when you discover that Google has really onerous terms when you try and use their base map. And that was part of what drove me to picking the OpenStreetMap stuff. So OpenStreetMap is all about the world as it exists today. And the community has built up a lot of great tools for making sure that you can verify that what's on the ground today is what's reflected on the map. There's a sister project, which I alluded to earlier, called Open Historical Map, and it uses the exact same technology stack as OpenStreetMap. And the difference being is that the planet file, the actual the map of the globe, is maps in the past. So in this case, we're going to take a really old map. In this case, it's a map from 1917. This is an original British trench map. So as you can see, it's a scan from an actual map, and it's got some wear and tear, and you can even see on the side there the fold and where it was dirty from being carried around. So it's clearly an old map. And I'm going to take a bit of a detour just for a second and show off part of a war diary. Has anyone ever looked at war diaries before? A couple people? Okay, so this is actually part of an insert for a war diary, and this was a plan of attack for one of the battalions. In this case, it's 3rd Battalion, which was a Toronto regiment. And if you look at it, you can read through, I'll just read a bit at the top there. So it talks about the 3rd wave will take trenches from B7C 7535 to B7D 1415, and then the 2 platoons of this wave will move forward and take Sunken Road and Commandant's House, and it goes on. So clearly that B7C 7535 is some sort of reference, but what the heck kind of grid reference system is that? Has anyone ever seen any kind of grid reference like that before? It's pretty unique. The whole British trench system was very unique, and it arose out of the circumstances of the time. So by the end of the war, they actually had pretty good coverage of almost the entire Western Front, from the North Sea right on down. And in this case, we're trying to find this grid reference, okay? So where is this B7C? And we actually, based on that excerpt from the war diary, we don't have enough information, but we happen to know that 3rd Battalion at the time was just south of Vimy, so it's actually 51B. And then we need to find out, okay, let's drill down deeper and find out where is this B7C area of the map. It gets a little squirrely, you'll see. So we zoom in a little bit, and you can see now we've got A and B, and that's how they divvied up the map sheets. So now we know, so the B is everything to the right of that. You can see that dividing line. And part of the reason I'm showing you all the different map artifacts on here is that when it comes time to trace them, we don't want to trace the map artifacts. We don't want to have a big A because that actually wasn't on the ground, clearly. And we also don't want to have all the reticle patterns where you see where it's divvied up into small little markers. So B7, I'm actually going to just highlight here how they've laid it out. So for the A sheet, for example, they actually overlay a grid pattern of from 1 to 36. And then they do the exact same thing with the B sheet, 1 to 36, and all the way down. So in this case, 1, 2, and then 7. So you can see the B7 is in the bottom center. Is everybody, am I going too fast? Is everybody following along? Okay, so B7. Now we're going to find out where's B7C. So for this part, we've got our 7 right in the middle, and now we have to mentally overlay 4 quadrants. So we've got A, B, C, and D. So in this case, B7C is going to be in the bottom left. And then we're going to divvy it up. You can see along the side there's some hash marks, and that's, you can divvy that down and from 1 to 10. So it goes X axis and then Y axis. So you go lengthwise first. So B7C 7535 puts us right about there. Does everyone see how I got that?
Yeah.
Not really? It's a bit convoluted. There's a reason they abandoned this system and no one ever uses it anymore. But this is how they fought the First World War. So that was where they started. So that you can see that position just is part. It's on a red line, and that's to indicate that it's a German trench system. So they're going to move down from there, and then remember when we were looking at the excerpt from the war diary, it showed they were going to go then to B7D 1415. So now we know the system. It should be a little bit easier to figure out the second time. So B7D is in the bottom right-hand quadrant, and then 1415 puts us right about there. down and take the commandant's house. So that's how you read the wonderful British trench map coordinate system. And again, the main reason I'm showing you these things is that all those map artifacts, so that you can read that coordinate system, we don't want to trace those. We don't want them to be on our digital map, which is part of the coordinate system coordinate. So, now that we understand how to read the map, now we're going to try and put it into a modern GIS system. And for that I was using Quantum GIS. Is everybody familiar? Most people familiar? Not at all familiar? Okay. So Quantum GIS, a lot of people are familiar with the sort of 800-pound gorilla of the GIS world, ArcGIS. So Quantum GIS is the free open source sort of leading competitor to ArcGIS. And Jerome will have some other things to say on other competing products, including his, which I would encourage you to check out as well. But for this one, I wanted to use what Rob Warren, the person who had done the initial tracing, had used, and that was Quantum GIS. So, how are we going to get this into Quantum GIS? I'm just showing you this part of the map here so that we can try and get some hints as to what in the world kind of projection we're going to put this in. So has anybody heard of the GSGS projection? Anyone? You've heard of it?
Yeah, I've heard that one.
Okay.
This in passing.
Okay.
And concrete columns is teaching.
Okay. So they may have mentioned it.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's actually what GS stands for is Geographical Section General Staff. And basically what this tells us is that this map is in a series of 1 to 10,000. So there's a whole pile of these maps that they produced, essentially for artillery. And I'll just mention that the coordinate system, all it returns when you follow those grid references down is it gives you a 5-yard by 5-yard square. So it doesn't actually give you a point, it gives you a 5-yard by 5-yard square. And the reason is that this map was created for artillery. So as long as you're somewhere your round gets in that 5-yard by 5-yard square, good enough, right? So they didn't bother breaking it down any more than that. That's not really helping us to get where we're going. How do we get this into Quantum GIS? So if we look at some of the other artifacts on the map, we can see that we've got this 77 and what is that, 60 or 80, it's kind of hard to make out, MS, and 116,000, right, MW. Any guesses on what that might be about? It turns out that that is meters west and meters south of the point of origin. There's a reason they don't use this system anymore. And the point of origin was a, okay, how can I say this? It was a old observatory in Brussels that moved 3 times. So, like we're halfway there, but seem to be getting further away from getting this into Quantum GIS. Anyway, we'll cut to the chase. Basically, there's nothing on this map that's going to help you get it into Quantum GIS all by itself. So you have to talk to someone with some map knowledge. And when I talked to Rob Warren, he explained that you have to actually create your own custom projection to be able to get this into QGIS. And the way we do that is we specify that it's, for the GIS folks here present, it's using the Bond projection, the old Delambre 1810 ellipsoid, and then that crazy number string off to the side is where we actually specify what the point of origin was. And we're not actually using any of the 3 locations of that old Belgian observatory, but someone has done a lot of work to try and figure out that if you use that exact coordinate system, you will get the best and the closest to that entire Western Front trench map system. So that's what we use. So now we got our projection. Am I going too fast? Okay. So we've got our projection keyed into QGIS, and now the only thing that we can actually key in that we know for sure is the 4 corners of the map, right? Because each of the 4 corners, they have in writing how far west, how far south from the point of origin. So So if we take a look, once we've got the four corners pegged, the place where we're going to have the largest errors is at the edges of the map. Because in this old trench map system, all the squares are identical. So they don't scale at all. It's just, they're completely square. And there's some other errors with it, so that even while it's calibrated in yards, and all those reticle patterns that you see on the map were in yards, the map is in meters away from the point of origin. It's a crazy system. Anyway, at this far edge of the map, what I've done is I've just overlaid our georeferenced map with the four corners pegged in, and then we've got modern satellite imagery underneath it. So if we look here, here's the modern satellite road, and then we've got our road from the georeferenced map. And as you can see, we're off by a fair bit, definitely 20 yards, 30 yards, 50 yards in places, and nowhere do they match up. So we don't really want to start tracing just with this map done. Now it'd be really, really tempting to just say, hey, well, let's plunk a ground control point on that road and then pinch the road over that way. And the main danger of doing that is that in 100 years, roads move a lot sometimes. So it's really dangerous to do that because we can introduce a lot of errors needlessly. So that brings us to the next question then. There's got to be a way we can improve this. So does anyone have any ideas on what might not change so much in 100 years that we could use for ground control points?
Farmhouses.
Pardon me?
Farmhouses, buildings.
Okay, you're on the right track with some kinds of buildings.
Land features.
Okay, so with land features, especially when there's hundreds and hundreds of tons of artillery flying all over the place, they actually change a lot.
Yeah, I guess.
And there's a reference to another part of the Western Front where the British packed in 500 tons of explosives under a hill and completely blew up the entire hill. It was gone. So it's tempting to use land features like that, but it's dangerous as well. So
Churches.
churches.
Yeah, in fact.
Churches. Okay. So yes, we're going to use a church to do it. Now, unfortunately, in this Vimy area, all the churches were completely destroyed in the First World War. However, after the war, they were rebuilt on the original footprint. And someone has actually gone and done all the hard work to verify and confirm that the church steeples of all the churches on all these maps are in the identical, like within 5 yards of where they were back before the First World War. So churches is what we're going to use. So in this case, again, we're looking at satellite imagery for the base map, and then we've got our georeferenced map as an overlay. So we're going to take the exact center of the map, and then we want to shimmy it up and to the right and get it onto the church steeple from the satellite image. So when you look at it, I mean, it looks like there's a prominent church steeple that's sticking right out. I think you can probably see it there. But it's kind of like an odd shape for a church steeple at a church. So I thought, you know what, let's maybe do a bit of ground sleuthing of our own here. And when we go to Google Street View, which is what I use to check it out, it turns out that's not actually the church steeple. So it's a cenotaph for the First World War. But if we look up and to the right, or left, pardon me, then we can actually see the church steeple. So now we have enough information to go back. And instead of putting it on the cenotaph, we're going to actually put it on the church steeple. Anyway, you get the idea. It can be a little tedious to plot out all the different church steeples, but once we've done that, and there's, I think, 6 or 7 church steeples on the map, and there's one other sort of half land feature, half building that we can use, and that's rail beds. It turns out that the rail beds actually don't move at all. So when you see a rail bed, and there was actually a few parts on this map where it was very helpful to be able to say, you know what, we can at least inch it over toward the rail beds, and that's going to help us. Back and compare again. So again, there's our road from the satellite imagery. And there's our road now from our georeference maps. As you can see, it's a lot tighter, and in a lot of places it overlaps. And that's going to be good enough. It would be really hard to get this right on because, again, the ground moves, there's changes with buildings and things, but this is going to be good enough for our purposes. So now in Quantum GIS, there's a tool called QTiles, and that's what we're going to use to build our tile set. And it's a free plugin, and we're not actually changing any of the default values. We're just going to go ahead and run the tile server as it is. And this generates about 400 megs of tiles. For anyone who's not familiar, what we're trying to do I'm sure you've gone on Google Maps before, and you've zoomed in, and as you zoom in, then you get better and better resolution. So that's what this whole system does, is it creates a whole mess of graphic files, PNG files, that give you that better resolution as you zoom in. And that gives you a map, something like this, which as you can see is just overlapped on top of, in this case, the modern OpenStreetMap. And I just hosted this, like I said, it generated about 400 megs worth of PNG files in a very structured, directory structure folder. And you can serve it from pretty much anywhere. So I just hosted mine on a really, really cheap web server that I lease for $12 a year. Doesn't have to be fancy. But on that server, they give me 48 gigs worth of storage before I have to bump up to, I think their next tier is $15 a year or something like that. So anyway, I found my tile server solution. And then, this is what I did for my Christmas vacation this year, is I just sat at home and I started tracing. So you can get a bit of an idea about how this map progressed. And I really needed a break from what I was doing at the Defense Department, and this was a perfect way for me to just chill out and do a little bit of tracing. And all told, this is maybe about, let's say, about 30 hours that I put in over the holidays, which built it out a lot, but clearly there's a lot more that could be done. So, to build out the rest of the map, I don't want to do all this by myself. This is supposed to be a community project, and there's a great way to actually get community involvement, and that's with something called a tasking manager. So, for people that are familiar with OpenStreetMap, has anyone edited OpenStreetMap here before? A couple of people? Okay, great. So to do the editing is pretty straightforward. I'll show you a little bit more of that as we go on. But they've actually, some of the people in the OSM community have built something called a tasking manager. And what it does is it allows you to create a project to map part of the world, and then it allows you to break that project down into little segments. And then one person will just grab one segment and do that, and then someone else will validate it, and that's how you get the map built. And in this case, I just grabbed the code for the the OSM tasking manager from GitHub, and over a couple months figured out how the code worked, and then tweaked it to point to Open Historical Map instead. For those of you who are interested, it's got a Python backend, and it uses an Angular JavaScript front end. So when you piece those two components together, you can get it to map pretty much anything within the OpenStreetMap technology stack. And this is what it looks like when you actually get a project up and running. So as you can see, in this case, this is the Vimy map. You've got probably 2/3 of it done. And we've got our tiles from the that we just did from before, and then that allows you to use pretty much whatever mapping tool you want to contribute. There's a number of ways to edit OpenStreetMap and Open Historical Map. And then we've also got a bit of the map legend, because the key for Open Historical Map and OSM, OpenStreetMap, is the tagging. So you're going to draw pretty much lines and nodes, and then how you tag them determines how they're going to get rendered on the map. So in this case, we don't actually have first and second and third class roads from 100 years ago that we have to try and fix. Once you grab your square and you say, this is the part that I want to edit, then it'll open up what in this case they call the ID editor. It's part of the OpenStreetMap stack. And then it's just going to have our base georeferenced map underneath. And then these are all the places that we can trace. And as you can see here, we're just supposed to stay within the pink border or the purple border. And that's the task area then. And that's a lot more manageable and a lot less daunting than calling up the entire map and going, wow, where am I going to start? And map tracing is actually pretty simple. So in this case, remember we were talking about this area around the commandant's house where the 3rd Battalion was going to go? These lines were traced by my 8-year-old son. So it's not really that hard to do. And that's where I'm going to ask for you to check it out and actually go to the tasks.openhistoricalmap.org and check it out and sign up if you haven't already, and just take a square and map for a little bit. It's not really important if you finish it, although it'd be nice if you at least finished your square, but just get a feel for it. And maybe it's not your thing, but I'm pretty sure you know someone who it is their thing. So, as you can see from the Rockland-Coeur map, there's still a lot of squares that aren't done yet. And we're coming up on the 101st anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And we're really trying to pull out all the stops here to make sure that we have a complete digital map of the whole battlefield area in time for the April 9, 101st anniversary. If you have no idea where to start at all, there are some introductory videos on the site. So we've got some videos to explain how to sign up for an account, how to trace roads, how to trace buildings. They're just 2 minutes long. And there's the website URL, tasks.openhistoricalmap.org. And if anyone has any questions right now. Yeah.
I had a question regarding the digitization.
Yep.
In ArcGIS, we have the ability to do a supervised classification of landform features. That basically what it can allow is to kind of digitize automatically. So once the supervised classification is done, you can actually convert your classified image into a polygon. So basically, what it can create, for example, city roads, for example, it can actually identify those city roads for you and digitize them automatically for you, rather than doing a manual digitized operation. But I'm sure it's a little bit more involved here because you're using an old map.
Yeah, so I mean, people have brought up this automated process to me in the past for different reasons, and there's so ArcGIS is one. What's the other? There's a number of providers that do similar automated tracings. I haven't had a chance or the money to buy any of these tools and try it out myself. Part of it is we're trying to start a community project, but I mean, I'm all for shortcuts. So if you want to take this and just try and run it through ArcGIS and just see what you get, I'd love to see the results from it. Because if you get anything better than like 70%, that would be fantastic. Just as an aside, Facebook has started getting into the OpenStreetMap game, and they've been building out a lot of Southeast Asia using AI and pretty advanced tools like that to trace satellite imagery. And the best they can do is about 70%. And then they have to rely on people for the other 30%. So I have yet to see a solution that gets anywhere even close to 80. It's still early in the game for this type of thing. But I remember PCI was here 6 months ago, 9 months ago, and they were showing off part of their solution for automated tracing. And even then, their ratio was still not to the point where you could do the whole thing without any kind of human involvement.
No, you can't do it completely because even the supervised classification operation tends to have errors within it.
Yep.
And the likelihood of you getting a complete identification is within the 70% range. The rest you have to actually digitize manually, which I did as my AutoCAD project when I was working there, and I had to digitize a lot of stuff manually. But I did some automatically.
Okay, yeah, so if you don't mind, I'm happy to give you whatever details you're going to need to load up either of these, the Vimy map or the Rockland-Coeur map, into ArcGIS, and I'd love to see what the results are. Okay, well, thank you for watching my presentation, and hope to see you on the tasking management. So cool. Thank you.